According to modern cosmology, the universe began in a state of almost infinite density, pure energy compressed into a single, trembling singularity. For billions of years, nothing existed but pressure. Then, in less than a fraction of a second, that pressure reached a critical point. It ruptured. The Big Bang wasn't chaos. It was transformation, the first proof that collapse and creation are two sides of the same law. And in a way, so are you. Every major expansion of consciousness follows the same physics. Tension builds until the old form can't contain it. What looks like breakdown is actually reorganization. Jung saw this in the human psyche long before physicists described it in matter. He called it individuation, the process by which the personality disintegrates and reforms around something deeper, something more whole. When your life starts to implode, relationships end, identity cracks, certainty evaporates, it isn't the universe turning against you. It's the psyche mirroring cosmic law. Pressure before expansion. Shadow before self. Just as the universe needed darkness to reveal light, the soul needs friction to ignite awareness. The tests you face aren't random. They are the psyche's equivalent of gravitational tension, drawing every fragmented part of you toward a single point of integration. The people who trigger you, the plans that collapse, the silence after something ends, all of it is matter rearranging itself around meaning. Right before a breakthrough, you experience your own inner Big Bang. Everything that once kept you stable begins to tremble. Energy that used to orbit safely now surges toward the center, forcing you to choose, resist the contraction, or allow it to explode into light. Jung wrote that there is no birth of consciousness without pain. Modern astrophysics would agree. The universe itself was born from pressure it could no longer bear. So when life compresses you, when every door closes and your mind feels like it's collapsing under its own gravity, pause. You are witnessing the same force that birthed galaxies working inside you. The collapse is not a failure. It's physics. It's psychology. It's the sacred algorithm of transformation. Because the universe doesn't test to punish. It tests to synchronize. It makes sure that the next version of you can withstand the magnitude of the expansion you've asked for. If you're at that threshold, in the tension before the breakthrough, stay. In the next few minutes, we'll explore how this cosmic law echoes through Jung's map of the soul, projection, shadow, the self. We'll decode why the test always comes before the rise, and how to stand still in the explosion, until your own light finally breaks through. Every birth leaves behind a silence. After the Big Bang, there were 380,000 years where light could not yet travel, a universe filled with heat, noise, and particles that hadn't learned how to speak to each other. Scientists call it the cosmic dark age. Jung would call it the nigredo, the black stage of alchemy, when the old identity dissolves and nothing coherent remains. Psychologically, this is the moment when life goes quiet in all the wrong ways. The phone stops ringing. Projects stall. People disappear. You look for the next sign, the next coincidence, and nothing answers. Yet beneath that stillness, the soul is rearranging its physics. The psyche has to lose signal with the outside world, so it can retune to an inner frequency. We mistake this silence for abandonment, but it's incubation. When consciousness expands, the old neural constellations, the thoughts, habits, and emotional reflexes that kept you orbiting familiar pain, start to fade. Your brain literally begins building new pathways, new synapses that haven't yet lit up. You don't see progress because the light hasn't reached the surface. Jung wrote that the unconscious works in the dark, unknown to itself. That darkness is not absence, it's gestation. Just as the early universe hid the blueprint for galaxies within invisible plasma, your stillness hides the pattern of your next evolution. The ego calls it stagnation. The self calls it calibration. So if you're in that quiet now, the job that won't open, the relationship that went silent, the dream that paused midair. Remember the physics. Energy never disappears. It condenses before it shines. The pressure that once felt like chaos has already shifted into coherence. You just haven't seen the light scatter yet. The test here is patience. Can you hold the silence without trying to fill it? Can you stay in the void without naming it failure? Because dawn always begins invisibly, photons gathering long before the horizon blushes. And the psyche follows the same choreography. First, the collapse into stillness. Then, the first particle of awareness. Then, illumination. The dark age of the soul isn't punishment for falling behind. It's proof you aligned with the oldest rhythm in the cosmos. Expansion born from pressure, light born from quiet. Stay in that silence a little longer. Because that's where the next universe of you is quietly forming. When Jung studied dreams, myths, and symbols, he noticed a pattern that looked eerily like the laws of physics. Every action in the psyche generates its opposite. Every image seeks its reflection. He called this the principle of compensation, the psyche's way of restoring balance when consciousness drifts too far toward one extreme. If your conscious mind clings to control, the unconscious will stage chaos. If you define yourself through perfection, it will send you failure. If you hide grief behind productivity, it will find a face in someone who disappoints you. The universe isn't judging, it's mirroring. Jung wrote that the unconscious behaves as though it were a compensating organ. What you call a test is the self-attempting homeostasis, the same law that keeps galaxies from collapsing under gravity. The more you resist the unacknowledged part of you, the stronger the gravitational pull becomes. So life repeats the same scenario with increasing mass until awareness equals integration. Every person you meet is part of this physics. The friend who betrays you reenacts the distrust you secretly hold toward yourself. The mentor who disappoints you reveals your dependency on external authority. The partner who withdraws mirrors the piece of you that fears intimacy but won't admit it. These encounters are projections, not illusions, but psychological holograms cast by the energy you've refused to reclaim. Projection is not a flaw, it's communication. The psyche externalizes what it cannot yet hold internally, turning the world into a classroom of mirrors. The lesson ends not when the situation disappears, but when you recognize your reflection and withdraw the projection back into awareness. That's the moment the test dissolves. Modern neuroscience supports this ancient intuition. When the brain detects contradiction between expectation and experience, it fires a prediction error signal, the same shock you feel when the world doesn't match your story. That neural jolt is the biological echo of Jung's compensation principle. The self is updating the model. Pain is data. In Jungian terms, each disruption is an invitation to individuation, the lifelong process of uniting consciousness with the unconscious, ego with self. The universe repeats patterns until you integrate the polarity, strength with vulnerability, independence with belonging, light with shadow. The moment you stop fighting the reflection, energy that was trapped in conflict becomes available for creation. So when everything around you starts to feel like déjà vu, same argument, same rejection, same ending, don't ask why again. Ask, what am I refusing to see? Because the mirror doesn't move on until you do. Jung warned that what we fail to make conscious appears outside us as fate. But once it's seen, the mirror shifts from punishment to portal. Awareness bends the law. Repetition turns into revelation. That's why the universe seems to test you right before you rise. It's verifying coherence between the person you claim to be and the self you're becoming. The exam is open book, written in every face and circumstance around you. And when you finally recognize the reflection as your own, the test ends, not because you escaped it, but because there's nothing left to prove. Every soul that grows must eventually face a collapse, not as punishment, but as a necessary stage in evolution. There comes a moment when the roles you've mastered no longer fit, when the words that once defined you feel foreign, when the life you built suddenly seems to resist your own presence. What looks like failure is often the psyche rearranging itself for expansion. Jung called this the death of the persona, the collapse of the social mask we build to survive the world. The persona isn't false, it's simply incomplete. It keeps us functioning, belonging, being loved. But when we confuse the mask with our face, the unconscious begins to rebel. And eventually, life conspires to break the illusion. Let's hear the story of Elise. Elise had spent her entire adult life designing things that wouldn't fall apart. She was an architect, precise, admired, always in control. Her drawings were flawless, her projects punctual, her reputation unshakable. To her colleagues, she was the embodiment of composure. To herself, she was proof that order could silence chaos. But control was never her gift. It was her defense. Her childhood had been marked by instability, a father whose moods changed like weather, a mother who never finished a sentence without apology. Structure became her sanctuary. Every clean line she drew was an act of self-rescue, a way of building walls high enough to keep the unpredictable world out. Then, one winter morning, her firm announced massive layoffs. She lost her job in a 15-minute meeting. At first, she told herself it was fine, a break, maybe even a blessing. But days turned into weeks, and the silence began to feel heavy. The emails stopped. The calls never came. Without her title, her calendar, her purpose, Elise found herself standing inside a blueprint she no longer understood. The mornings that used to hum with certainty became long corridors of static. She wandered through her apartment like a ghost inspecting an abandoned structure, opening drawers she didn't remember closing, sketching shapes that led nowhere. The control she once worshipped turned into paralysis. She couldn't design her way out of this version of herself. And that's when the dreams began. Night after night, she saw a child crouched beneath a bridge, clutching rolled blueprints that dissolved in the rain. The child never spoke, but always looked up at her with the same expression, part fear, part expectation, as if waiting for permission to step out. At first, Elise dismissed it as stress, but the dream persisted, and with every repetition, she felt something inside her loosening, a quiet grief, the kind you don't cry, the kind you remember. She began to sense that the child wasn't a stranger at all, but a fragment of her own soul, the version that had learned to survive chaos by hiding under bridges and drawing perfect worlds in secret. Jung described this descent as nigredo, the blackening, the necessary stage where old identities dissolve before rebirth. The ego calls it a crisis, but the psyche knows it as reorganization. What looks like the end is often a system overloaded with the weight of its own outdated architecture. In the months that followed, Elise began to draw again, not because she had clients, but because she couldn't not. Her sketches changed. The rigid geometries softened into organic curves. Buildings sprouted gardens, lines breathed. It was as if her hands remembered something her mind had long forgotten, that creation was never meant to be control. It was communion. Without realizing it, she was integrating her shadow through art, the chaos she had feared, the vulnerability she had buried, the tenderness she had mistaken for weakness. Her new designs weren't monuments of perfection anymore. They were ecosystems for light and life. That's how individuation works. The old persona disintegrates, not to destroy you, but to return the energy you buried with your unlived parts. The conscious and the unconscious begin to speak again, and in that dialogue, the self, the unbreakable center Jung described, starts to emerge. When the ego refuses to evolve, the unconscious orchestrates circumstances that make stagnation impossible. That orchestration can look like chaos, job loss, heartbreak, illness, but its purpose is restoration. Jung called it enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when pushed to the extreme. When you've lived too long in control, life introduces disorder. When you've hidden your pain behind productivity, life removes the structure that allowed the hiding. It isn't cruelty. It's compensation. In Elise's case, the universe didn't take her job. It took her mask. The pressure she had escaped for years finally reached critical mass. And like the Big Bang, it erupted into creation. From the rubble of her old identity, a new form of consciousness began to emerge, one that could hold both strength and softness, both precision and surrender. That's the paradox of the breaking point. What feels like destruction is often design. The same intelligence that holds galaxies in balance is at work inside the psyche, dismantling what no longer supports the weight of who you're becoming. So when your own structures start to crumble, when you lose the title, the plan, the version of yourself you thought was permanent, don't rush to rebuild. Sometimes the dust itself is sacred. The collapse is simply the soul making room for light. After the collapse, there comes a peculiar kind of silence. It's not peace, not yet. It's the vacuum left when every plan, every title, every familiar rhythm suddenly loses meaning. The world still moves, but you no longer move with it. Friends keep talking about projects and goals while you feel suspended, as if someone pressed pause on the soundtrack of your life. Jung would call this interval the alchemical rest, a phase when the old pattern has burned away but the new form hasn't yet taken shape. It's a moment of psychic reorganization, invisible from the outside but immense within. The ego, stripped of its roles, panics in the absence of direction. It wants to fix, to rebuild, to make something happen. Yet the psyche operates on a different logic, one closer to nature than ambition. It knows that seeds do not sprout by effort but by stillness, by darkness, by time. The test comes in ordinary disguises. It's waking up and realizing no one needs you that morning, and resisting the urge to fill the emptiness with noise. It's opening a message thread that used to feel alive and finding it silent for weeks, yet choosing not to chase the conversation. It's sitting at your desk with no idea what comes next, and allowing that not knowing to exist without labeling it failure. It's watching others move ahead, post their victories, build their futures, while you remain here, half-formed, resisting the urge to rush just to feel real again. The void tests your faith not in the universe, but in yourself, in your ability to stay open without visible progress. Jung saw this as the psyche's most sacred threshold, when consciousness must learn the art of waiting without collapsing into despair. The ego interprets stillness as stagnation, but the unconscious calls it incubation. It's the brain, the body, the self-aligning frequencies. When nothing appears to be happening, everything essential is being rewired beneath awareness. The way tectonic plates move silently while shaping entire continents. In those long stretches of quiet, life keeps whispering small instructions. Sleep more. Walk slower. Read something meaningless. Let the world spin without your supervision. And if you obey, you begin to feel the subtle pulse beneath the silence, a faint rhythm that doesn't ask for performance, only presence. The irony is that we live in a culture allergic to waiting. Productivity is worshipped. Stillness is treated like failure. But Jung warned that hurry is not of the soul. Transformation has its own tempo, closer to lunar cycles than business plans. When the psyche withholds momentum, it's because the soil beneath consciousness is still regenerating. You may not see it, but the void is full. Every unanswered prayer, every delay, every cancelled plan is energy being redirected. The universe removes noise so that a single, true note can be heard. What feels like loss is calibration. What feels like emptiness is space being made for light. So if you're standing in that silence right now, between the life that ended and the one that hasn't begun, Hold your ground. Don't rush to rebuild. Don't chase meaning too soon. The quiet is not a punishment, it's a tuning. Because every instrument, before it plays in harmony, must first learn to hum in silence. And this, right here, is your tuning phase, the moment before the rise. From this moment, subtle but unmistakable, when the long stillness begins to move. It doesn't start with clarity or fireworks. It begins with faint ripples, small, almost invisible changes that whisper, something new is forming. This is the threshold of transformation, the fragile space between ending and beginning, where the psyche starts to test its new wings. After long silence, awareness sharpens. You begin to notice coincidences again, not the magical kind that promise answers, but the gentle ones that restore connection. A book that falls open at the exact page you needed, a stranger echoing words you were just thinking, a memory surfacing right when you were ready to reinterpret it. Jung called these patterns synchronicities, events linked not by cause, but by meaning. They are the psyche's way of saying, I'm with you again. Other signs are quieter still. You wake one morning and realize your first thought isn't fear. The ache that once filled your chest feels lighter. You catch yourself smiling at something ordinary, sunlight on the floor, the sound of rain, and for the first time in months, it doesn't feel borrowed. These are not random shifts. They are signals that energy has begun to flow again. The psyche, once fragmented, is rediscovering rhythm. In daily life, it looks simple. You start cleaning a corner of the house that has been untouched for weeks, without deciding to. You finally reply to the message you'd been avoiding. You walk without headphones, and the silence feels less like absence and more like air. You find that your sentences are no longer made of reasons, but of truth. Jung believed that transformation doesn't arrive as enlightenment descending from above, but as integration rising from below. The self reorganizes quietly, like dawn rearranging light before the sun breaks the horizon. That's why breakthroughs are rarely loud. They emerge as a soft certainty that what once broke you no longer defines you. This threshold can be confusing. The ego still wants proof, still fears relapse, still wonders if it's real. But the deeper part of you knows. You recognize the subtle shift in gravity. You're no longer orbiting the wound, you're moving toward purpose. The same events that once triggered anxiety now feel neutral, even instructive. The same silence that once terrified you now feels sacred. Transformation isn't about becoming new. It's about remembering what was always there, beneath the noise. The rise isn't vertical. It's inward, a recentering around the self, the quiet axis that holds every part of you together. So if life feels gentler lately, don't question it. That calm is the first language of wholeness. The universe doesn't announce that you've passed the test. It mirrors your peace back to you. You've crossed the threshold. You may not see the sunrise yet, but the horizon has already begun to glow. Integration begins when pain stops asking for attention and starts revealing its meaning. Jung saw this stage as alchemy, the transformation of raw emotion into awareness. Nothing is erased. What once burned now illuminates. You notice it in small ways. The argument that no longer drains you, the memory that no longer hurts, the silence that no longer feels hostile. Energy once trapped in resistance now fuels understanding. The fear that kept you small becomes intuition. The shame that silenced you turns into empathy. Jung wrote that the gold is in the dark. He meant that the treasure of consciousness lies exactly where we least wanted to look. By facing what we feared, we reclaim the strength hidden inside it. Integration is not perfection, it's coherence. It's the quiet power of someone who has stopped splitting themselves between before and after. The parts you tried to bury were never your weakness. They were fragments of your wholeness waiting to return. That's what it means to turn pain into power. To let what once broke you become the ground that holds you steady. There comes a quiet turning point when life stops testing you, not because everything is perfect, but because you've changed the way you meet what comes. The same situations appear, the same uncertainties, the same human dramas, but they no longer pull you apart. Something inside has aligned. This is ascension in its real form, not rising above the world, but moving through it with consciousness. Jung called it the reconciliation of opposites, the moment the ego no longer fights the unconscious, and the self moves as one current through all your contradictions. It's what happens when you finally understand that peace is not the absence of tension, but the capacity to hold it without losing center. You start noticing the difference in small ways. You no longer chase answers. You listen for timing. You don't beg life to open doors. You read the rhythm and knock once. The silence that once frightened you now feels sacred. The chaos that once broke you now feels like part of the pattern. At this stage, the universe stops whispering lessons through friction because you've learned to hear them through intuition. Synchronicity returns, not as proof, but as poetry. The mirror doesn't test you anymore. It reflects coherence. The truth is, you were never being examined. You were being tuned. Every pressure, every collapse, every delay was calibration, adjusting your frequency until your energy could hold the magnitude of what you were asking for. And now, when you look back, you see the symmetry, the silence before the dawn, the breaking point, the void, the threshold, the light. Every stage was a single movement of the same cosmic law that governs galaxies and souls alike. Expansion born from compression, creation born from collapse. You were the Big Bang all along. The explosion was never destruction. It was birth. If this journey resonated with you, let's keep walking together. Subscribe to Hidden Mind. Share this with someone who's still in the silence. And tell me in the comments which part of your path feels like the test before the rise. Because when we name our transformation out loud, we remind someone else that the universe doesn't punish, it awakens. And sometimes, all awakening needs is to be witnessed.